That silence happened inside a congressional hearing room on an otherwise ordinary morning. And the woman sitting inside it, one of the most quoted, most photographed, most magnetic political voices of her entire generation, had nobody to blame. Not the opposing party, not a hostile moderator, not a leak, not a smear, not a coordinated attack. She had walked into that chamber carrying her own ammunition, organized it neatly on the table in front of her, and then proceeded to fire every single round directly into her own chest. The man across the table didn't even raise his voice. He didn't need to understand what made this confrontation different from the thousand other congressional hearings that get streamed, clipped, and forgotten by Thursday. You need to first understand what this room felt like before it even began. The official schedule listed the session as a standard oversight hearing on Western Hemisphere policy. That description was technically accurate and almost completely misleading. The word on the Hill, passed between staffers in hallways, whispered across cafeteria tables, was that the Secretary of State was coming to face the House, and that a particular congresswoman from New York had specifically requested speaking time. Those two facts together created a gravitational pull that packed the chamber well beyond what the calendar would have predicted. Press credentials were maxed, the media row along the back wall was stacked 3 reporters deep in some spots. Observers who couldn't get seats stood pressed against the side walls in spaces that were technically supposed to remain clear. You could feel it in the room, that particular electric density that forms when a large group of experienced political observers collectively sense that something beyond the routine is about to unfold. And somewhere in the 4th row of public seating, largely invisible to everyone in that charged atmosphere, sat a woman in a plain gray cardigan. She had come alone. She was holding a folded event program with both hands, squeezing it the way people grip things when their body needs something physical to hold on to. Nobody noticed her when she walked in. By the time the session ended, her face would be everywhere. She entered with the energy of someone who had already decided how the morning was going to end. That's not a criticism. That quality of absolute forward momentum is part of what made her one of the most compelling political figures of the past decade. She moved through rooms differently than most politicians. Where others entered cautiously, scanning for variables, she arrived like a conclusion, like someone who had already run every scenario and settled on the result. She placed her materials on the desk with the particular deliberateness of a person who understands that cameras catch everything, including the way you arrange your papers. Her documents were organized with precision, quotes, voting records, policy timelines, all of it highlighted in bright yellow, the kind of thorough preparation you do when you're planning to use specific evidence at specific moments. This was not someone winging it. This was a prosecutor who had built her case over weeks and was finally standing in the courtroom. Across the long committee table, the Secretary of State sat in a way that was almost aggressively unremarkable. If she was a current running through a wire, he was the wall. Still. Contained. Not reading anything. Not conferring with aides, not making any of the small performative gestures that politicians use to signal they're engaged. He was just there, present in the way that people are when they've sat in difficult rooms for a very long time and learned that stillness is its own form of power. He had one folder in front of him. He didn't open it. When the chairman gave her the floor, she didn't ease into it. She didn't offer the obligatory ritual thank yous that congressional testimony usually opens with, the kind that eat up 30 seconds and signal nothing. She cut straight through to the bone of what she'd come to say. She told Secretary Rubio she intended to be direct. She said the American public had grown exhausted, genuinely bone-deep exhausted, by political theater, by officials in expensive suits who had learned to use the language of freedom as a costume, dressing up policies that created real suffering in the vocabulary of liberation. She said there were people in that building who talked endlessly about Venezuelans suffering from the comfort of positions they had never had to sacrifice anything to occupy. People who had never been stateless, never been hungry in the survival sense, never felt fear that came from a government rather than a circumstance, and she implied directly, without the protection of ambiguity, that the man across the table was one of them. She said it with absolute conviction. She said it with the kind of righteous certainty that comes from genuinely believing every word leaving your mouth. And she said it directly to a man whose mother used to clock in through a hotel service entrance at dawn to clean rooms that other people slept in a country she chose because the alternative was an island where the government decided whether you were allowed to have opinions. She didn't know that yet. In approximately 20 minutes, she would. Here is what most people who watched clips of this confrontation missed because the clips were cut too short. He thanked her. That's how he opened. Genuine, unhurried gratitude for her passion and the sincerity of her emotion. No sarcasm in it, no political judo, no detectable edge. He acknowledged that she believed what she was saying, and he said he had no interest in debating her feelings. He said he wanted to work with facts, her facts specifically. She smiled at that. It was a thin, knowing smile, the expression of someone who is watching an opponent step into a trap they've already built. She told him she stood behind everything she had ever said publicly. He said he was glad to hear that, and suggested she hold on to that confidence for a few more minutes. What happened next is where the architecture of the exchange becomes visible in retrospect. He didn't go after her immediately. He started slowly, almost conversationally, with questions that seemed so basic they barely registered as strategic. How long had she been following Venezuela? Did she consider herself primarily a scholar of the issue, or was her advocacy more personal in nature? Was she comfortable defending the consistency of her positions across several years? Each question landed like a small stone being placed rather than thrown. He wasn't building momentum toward a dramatic revelation yet. He was drawing a map. She answered everything with total confidence, because she had total confidence. She had been talking about this issue for years. She had the receipts. She had the documents sitting right there on the desk, highlighted and organized and ready. That confidence is important to understand, because it explains everything that comes next. He told her he'd noticed something interesting about the way she talked about the Venezuelan crisis over the years. Not what she said, but how she said it. The specific vocabulary she reached for. He mentioned that whenever she discussed the origins of the humanitarian disaster, the millions of displaced people, the collapsed infrastructure, the families destroyed, she consistently used plural, collective framing. The region, all sides, complex geopolitical dynamics, external pressures. He described these as large containers, spacious enough to hold almost anything, including the people and forces most responsible for the suffering she said she cared about. He asked her a question so simple it could have come from a high school civics student. Over the course of her entire career as a passionate advocate for Venezuelan people, had she ever referred to the man governing that country as a dictator? Not in private, not in a footnote, on camera, in writing, in the public record where statements live permanently. The room shifted, not dramatically. There was no gasp, no visible reaction. But the quality of attention in the chamber changed, the way air pressure changes before weather. Everyone present understood that a very specific, very answerable question had just been asked, and the answer was either yes or it wasn't. She went to her framework. She said she had consistently opposed authoritarian governance in all its forms. She said she had criticized the anti-democratic conduct of his administration, the concealed election results, the suppression of political opposition. Her language was precise, principled, and carefully constructed. It was also an answer to a different question than the one he had asked. He pointed that out, gently, like a teacher who isn't angry, just patient. He said he heard her critique of his government. He was asking about him. One name, had she said it. She moved sideways again. He nodded slowly, the way someone does when they receive exactly what they expected. He said he noticed she seemed to prefer the institution over the individual, the administration over the administrator. He said there was something revealing in that preference, and he planned to return to it. This is the moment where the morning turned permanently. He reached into his folder, the one he had been sitting with untouched for the better part of an hour, and removed a single printed page. He held it for a moment, looked at it, and then did something that caught everyone in that room completely off guard. He didn't read it himself. He slid it across the table toward her. He explained that the document contained her words, her phrasing, her argument, written in exactly the voice she had spent years building and defending. He said he didn't want to read it back to her because he was worried he'd flatten it, get the rhythm wrong, make it sound less like her and more like a politician reciting an opponent's record. He said it deserved to be delivered by the person who wrote it. He asked if she would read it aloud. She looked at the page. You have to sit with what she was thinking in that moment, because it's the key that unlocks the entire sequence. She wasn't looking at a trap. She was looking at her best material. She recognized the quote. It was something she had written with care, something she had defended in public multiple times, something she believed in completely. He was essentially handing her a microphone and saying, "Make your case in your own words." For someone whose voice was her primary political instrument, this felt like an invitation, not a snare. She picked up the page. She read it clearly, with conviction, with the rhythmic confidence of someone who knows they're delivering a line that lands. She read that the asylum crisis facing the United States could not be honestly addressed without confronting the role of American foreign policy in creating the conditions that displaced millions of Venezuelans. She read that the sanctions regime championed by figures, including the current Secretary of State, had played a direct causal role in accelerating the humanitarian collapse. She read that any sincere conversation about refugee policy had to begin with acknowledging that American decisions contributed to American arrivals. She set the page down. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has just scored cleanly. He thanked her for the reading. He said she delivered it beautifully. Then he asked her to do one more thing before they moved on. He asked her to find, in that same paragraph she had just read, the name of the person the refugees were actually running from. She looked at the page. She looked for the name. The name wasn't there. She had written a detailed, eloquent, specific paragraph about why millions of people fled their country. She had named 2 American politicians in it. She had named a policy instrument. She had named a geopolitical dynamic. She had named a consequence. She had not named the man who ran the prisons those people were escaping. She had not named the man whose security forces disappeared people in the night. She had not named the man whose government her own written words had somehow managed to describe at length without ever once identifying by name. And she had just read that paragraph aloud on national television, in front of cameras broadcasting across 3 networks, with a grieving mother in the 4th row, who had crossed an ocean partly because of what that unnamed man's government did to her son's hands. The first laugh in the room was quiet, almost apologetic. A man near the press section who tried to suppress it and failed. A security officer near the railing who became suddenly fascinated by the middle distance. Not mockery, more like the involuntary sound a person makes when something so structurally precise occurs that the only available response is something close to awe. She had spent years as one of the sharpest political communicators in the country. She could locate hypocrisy across a crowded room from 50 yards. She could read the dynamics of a hostile audience and pivot in real time. She had walked into this specific hearing with a specific plan to expose a specific man's inconsistency. And she had just demonstrated, in her own handwriting, read aloud in her own voice, exactly what her critics had been saying for years. She wasn't finished. Give her this, she was not the kind of politician who went quietly. She understood that the room was shifting against her, and she moved immediately to reclaim it, not with defense, but with offense. She pivoted hard toward territory she knew, the documented record of his policy positions. She lifted her highlighted documents, the ones she had brought specifically for this purpose, and she read from them with controlled fury. She laid out the case against his support for terminating temporary protected status for Venezuelan nationals who were already legally settled in the United States. She named numbers hundreds of thousands of people. She quoted his own correspondence. She named specific policy positions he had publicly championed and then reversed or abandoned. She accused him of spending 15 years building a political identity around Venezuelan suffering and then, when it became inconvenient, signing his name to decisions that put those same people on planes back to the country they had sacrificed everything to leave. It landed cleanly. The journalist's pens were moving fast. An aide behind her nodded, the kind of small involuntary confirmation that means the attack has connected. The man who had been laughing was now staring at his lap because she had just put something true and heavy into the room. And truth has weight regardless of context. For a genuine moment, the energy in the chamber swung back toward her. She had found the one piece of ground where she was standing on documented reality, and she stood on it hard. Behind the secretary, an aide leaned close and delivered something brief and quiet. Rubio barely moved in response, a small nod, almost imperceptible. His hand shifted the closed folder a few inches without opening it. Every camera in the room caught that gesture. Nobody caught what it contained. The result was a specific kind of tension that anger can't manufacture. When someone is screaming, you brace against it. When someone quietly moves a folder they haven't opened yet, you lean forward. The entire chamber leaned forward. That sealed folder became the most powerful object in the room without anyone knowing what was inside it. He let her counterattack fully land before he responded. He let the applause she was hoping for either arrive or not arrive on its own schedule. Then he did the most disarming thing possible in an argument where your opponent is expecting escalation. He agreed with her. He said she was right about his role in the TPS decision. He confirmed it. He said it was among the most difficult calls he had made in public life, that real families absorbed real damage from it, and that he had not slept comfortably in the weeks around that decision. He said he was not going to stand in a congressional chamber and pretend that a policy with human consequences was clean or uncomplicated. He offered to debate the TPS decision at length if she wanted to pursue it. He even said she might score some valid points. Then he said that wasn't actually what she had come to do. He said she had come to make the American public believe he didn't care about Venezuelan people. He said he wanted to address that particular charge directly because he believed she had arrived at it through a specific kind of inexperience, not intellectual inexperience, but the kind that comes from having read about suffering rather than having absorbed it from someone you loved. And then the folder opened. He didn't pull out a legal brief. He didn't produce a policy document or a voting record or any of the instruments that political confrontations are typically fought with. He pulled out a photograph. Old colors faded to the amber gray of decades-old print. He didn't hold it up for the cameras. He looked at it himself for a moment, privately, genuinely, before laying it flat on the desk facing up, visible only to the people in the first few rows. He identified the building in the image as a hotel. He said someone had mailed the photograph to his office that morning, knowing the subject of the hearing, knowing what might come up. He pointed to a specific area in the image, a loading dock, a service entrance, the kind of door that exists in the back of every large building and gets used by the people who keep those buildings functioning for the people who never notice them. He said his mother had walked through that entrance every morning for 11 years. She had cleaned rooms on the other side of it. She had come home with sore hands and then come back the next day and done it again, because the alternative to that loading dock was an island where the man in charge had decided that citizens were property, that disagreement was treason, and that the correct response to resistance was a cage. He closed the folder. He said she kept relying on a particular frame, that the people coming across borders were running from economic sanctions, from policy instruments, from the decisions of governments, including ours. He said he had spent his childhood in kitchens and living rooms with those people. He had poured their coffee. He had sat with them while they described what they had seen. He said, sanctions are paper. You don't flee paper. You flee the person who decides what happens to your son when he raises his fist at a rally. She fought back. She accused him of doing something politicians do, wrapping policy positions inside personal biography to make them bulletproof, using the moral weight of his family's story as a shield against legitimate scrutiny. She said she was not attacking his mother. She was attacking his voting record. She argued those were entirely separate things, and that conflating them was a technique designed to end arguments rather than resolve them. It was her strongest remaining punch, and it connected. There's truth in that critique. Political backstory has been used that way before, to deflect accountability with sentiment. She called the move clearly, named it accurately, and for one suspended moment it looked like she had found the escape route. That's when the woman in the gray cardigan stood up. She rose slowly from the fourth row. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply stood, still holding the folded program, and when Rubio saw her, he gestured to the chairman in a way that said, "Give her a moment." The security guard who had moved toward her stopped. The chairman nodded. The woman spoke in English that carried the particular weight of a language someone learned as an adult, each word chosen with the care of someone who knows that careless language costs things. She said her name wasn't important. She said she was from Maracaibo, and she had arrived in 2018. She said she had been listening to the representative speak for years. She knew her name. She had watched her on TV. She had heard her talk about people like her, displaced, struggling, carrying the weight of a country that had been taken from them. And in all that time, in all those speeches and interviews and congressional statements, she had never once heard her say the name of the man responsible for what happened to her son. Her son, 24 years old, taken after a protest in 2017, 9 months of silence, of not knowing, and then a visit finally permitted, during which she discovered her son could no longer hold a glass of water in his hands. She did not elaborate on why. She didn't need to. She sat back down. The room did not react with laughter this time. What settled over the chamber was something heavier and more permanent than laughter. It was the specific gravity of a true thing being said by someone who had paid for the right to say it in the hardest possible currency. She offered her condolences, and they were genuine. The empathy was real. You could hear it, not performed, not calculated, but actual. She said she would never minimize what that family had endured. He interrupted her softly. He said he believed the apology. He said it for the record, clearly, so there would be no ambiguity about it later. He did not think she was cruel. He said what he thought she was something more complicated and in some ways harder to defend than cruelty. He said he believed she had spent years constructing a mental map of the world in which certain governments and certain actors were assigned the role of villain, and others, regardless of their actions, were simply not permitted to occupy that role in her framework. He said the man in Caracas had apparently never made her approved list. And he suggested that naming him, acknowledging him, Holding him to the same standard she held to others would have required her to admit something she wasn't ready to admit, that the ideological framework she had built her career on was capable of producing the same horrors she spent her career denouncing when they appeared under different flags. She started to respond with the traditional bridge phrase, the one that signals you're about to disagree respectfully. He stopped her. He said they were past that. Gently, without heat, the way someone speaks when they have run out of patience, but haven't surrendered their composure. He said they had been past respect since she stood up and told a room full of displaced people that they were being used as political theater. Since she delivered that line without noticing that a woman in the fourth row had lost her son to exactly the kind of regime she was too principled to name. He picked up the printed document, her document, the one she had read aloud, and held it up. He pointed out what it contained. His name, the president's name, a detailed analysis of American policy failures, and a complete, unbroken absence of the man whose prisons were the actual reason those families had boarded buses and boats and walked through desert heat to get somewhere else. He put the paper back down flat on the table. He said she had come to silence him by weaponizing the suffering of Venezuelan people. She had not named the one person most responsible for that suffering. He said those 11 words, 10 maybe, and the room understood that nothing else was necessary. She looked at her documents, the organized stack she had brought with such preparation, such certainty, the highlighted pages, the printed quotes, the evidence she had carried in that morning, like a woman carrying ammunition. She gathered them. She squared the edges, because some habits are too ingrained to abandon even in the worst moments. She turned the entire stack face down onto the desk. She folded it once. She pushed it away. She picked up her pen, held it over the notepad, set it back down without writing anything. When the chairman asked if she wanted to continue, her time wasn't up. She could keep going, she said 2 words. She yielded. And in a room so quiet that the microphone on the committee table picked up the dry paper sound of a printed stack being flipped over, those 2 words and that single sound became the loudest thing anyone heard all morning. The clip was cut, titled, and moving across every platform before the afternoon session began. 90 seconds. Her reading her own words with complete conviction. His quiet request for one name. The pause where the name should have been. The papers going face down. 90 seconds on a loop, everywhere, inescapable. The public debate that followed had almost nothing to do with the policy substance she had prepared so carefully. Nobody online was working through the complexities of TPS policy or debating the documented effects of economic sanctions on immigration patterns. They were watching the 90 seconds. They were watching it again. They were watching it again after that. Outside the chamber, a Democratic congressman who had voted alongside her consistently for years spoke to a reporter and refused to allow his name to be attached to his words. He said privately what many had apparently known for a long time, that the specific blind spot she had displayed that morning was not new, not accidental, and not a secret within certain circles. He said the silence around it had been a collective choice, a kind of institutional agreement to leave the soft spot untouched. He said the problem with that kind of agreement is that it only holds until someone asks the obvious question under bright lights. He said she had the bad luck of being asked by the one man in the Capitol, whose family had personally survived what she wouldn't name. He walked away before anyone could get a microphone near him. After the cameras had moved on, after the chamber had emptied, and the press had chased the louder stories out into the afternoon, the Secretary of State stood waiting in a quiet hallway away from the main corridor. He had asked someone to find the woman in the gray cardigan before she left the building. He didn't have a statement prepared. He didn't bring a photographer. When she came around the corner still holding her program, he simply took her hand in both of his own, and he spoke to her in Spanish, quietly enough that no one else heard what was said. She nodded. He let go, turned, and walked back toward the main corridor, back through the noise, the cameras, the journalists calling his name, past the empty hearing room where one of the most eloquent politicians of her generation had finally, after years of speaking, found herself with nothing left to say. He said the name of the man she had refused to name, once, quietly, almost to himself. In the specific way that someone says a thing they have said 1,000 times before and intend to say 1,000 times again, because stopping would be its own kind of surrender, and some things are too important to stop saying, no matter how many people in important rooms decide it's more convenient to leave them unspoken. Here is what stays with you after you've watched the full hearing and read the coverage and let the clip stop looping. The most powerful thing in that room all morning was not a voting record. It was not a highlighted document. It was not even a photograph of a loading dock where a woman used to punch a time card before the sun came up. The most powerful thing in that room was a name that was never said. a name that fit inside a sentence, a name that cost nothing to speak, a name that the woman in the fourth row had been waiting to hear from that particular podium for 6 years. Political language is full of absences, things we gesture toward without touching, people we describe without naming, realities we acknowledge in structure while denying in specifics. Most of the time, those absences are invisible, buried in the respectable bulk of everything else being said. Sometimes in a room quiet enough, you can hear them. And sometimes the sound of a stack of papers being turned face down on a wooden desk is the loudest thing anyone in the building has heard in years.